Shalom, everyone. Peace be unto you. Hope everyone is having a great day. It's your sister Shia back with another story time session. You can call it the Reading Rainbow. Same book. Uh, got interrupted yesterday. The same book, True and False Possession. I'm going to try to finish it up today. So, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Support your girl. All right. Okay, so here is another example, this time of a nun whose life in some respects resembles that of Sister Jean of the Angels. Like her, this sister was nominated prioress of her order considerably in advance of the legal age, which means that her conduct was considered specially edifying. Now, this religious on falling into ecstasy, used to have visions of God the Father and God the Son. But alternating with this, she sometimes perceived a third personage with the same appearance as the other two. But this one uttered only obscene words. It was well known that since adolescence, this nun used to fall several times a day into ecstatic states, during which her spirit seemed to be rapt from the earth and lost in a world unknown to ordinary mortals. The demonopathic phenomena were complicated by many other symptoms, which leave no doubt as to the really neuropathic nature of this strange behavior. Another nun, whom I had occasion to observe, attracted my attention because of the troubles she experienced during sleep. These consisted in a feeling of trance, of escape from ordinary sleep. This patient told me, then Jesus draws me to one side and I draw myself to the other so as not to yield to the ecstasy. When this ecstasy develops, I seem to be the prey of the demon, but Jesus has promised to enclose me in a box where Satan will never be able to reach me. Yes, the devil will make me commit many outward faults, but I shall not sin because my will has nothing to do with them. In this case, too, the subject wondered whether she had not been dreaming. In any case, we can say that during these trances, the state of consciousness is very far from normal, for while the memory of certain crises remains pretty clear, there are others of which the recollection is blurred or extinguished. I related in the Etudes Carmelitaines the very instructive observation of a girl whose writings and outward piety seemed to indicate that she was in the way of sanctity. When the religious authorities began to pay closer attention to her, stigmata appeared on her forehead, from which bleedings took place every Friday. But just when this girl seemed to be nearer to the mystical life, diabolic attacks began. Thus, suddenly one night it seemed as if a man leaped in front of her bed while the electric light went out and the room was lit with a reddish glow. The strange thing was, she said, that the eyes of this person followed me and his body shifted about according as I myself moved. As we may guess, she hastened to tell all these strange facts to her director, who did not understand. My eminent friend, Friar Bruno, who on several successive Fridays had been able to observe the bleeding from the forehead, begged the girl to come on Friday to my surgery after being supervised very closely by an intelligent girl of perfect good faith. This supervisor, who followed Madeline, the patient, everywhere and even shared her room, told us that openings had formed on her forehead whence bleeding flowed on several Fridays in succession. But what struck this observer still more was the multiplicity of the demon's assaults. If they went into a church, she said, the chairs moved, the curtains of the confessional shook violently. I have seen Madeline's shoes removed without her moving, a chair charred, while Madeline, who was sitting on it, was not burned. One night, an extraordinary thing happened. I was awakened out of a quiet sleep by a cry. Madeline turned on the electric light, took out a packet, and put out the light. Immediately, there was a smell of burning, and Madeline showed me a half burned shimmy. Convinced, contrary to our supervisor's statements, that all these phenomena were only fabrications, we asked Madeline to come one Friday to my surgery, where she would be received by Friar Bruno and myself. Our hope was disappointed, for the same morning we received a letter from which I quote this passage. For more than 6 months, I have been in interior conflict with the demon. It was a ruthless struggle between the Spirit of God, who urged me to good, and another spirit which flung me into evil. All these stories you have heard are just a continual lie, and I only wish I could tell you what misery I am in. I have let myself be persuaded more and more often, obliged to speak, to act against myself. I have imagined all these stories for what motive I do not know, and I feel more and more unhappy, being unable to speak as I should wish to. I have never had terrible visions of the devil, but at certain times I felt him close to me. It was he who made me burn my shimmy in spite of myself. I do not remember. This confession should be compared with that of Sister Jean of the Angels, who appeared one day during the trial of Urban Grandier, clad only in a shift, in pouring rain, to make honorable amends, and who wrote, "If obedience were to allow me, I should describe with great pleasure all my maladies in detail. Hypocrisy, duplicity, arrogance, self-esteem, and self-seeking, with all my other vices, in order to oblige those who might read this writing to plead for mercy from the divine justice, which I have so many times offended." The confession of Sister Magdalene of the Cross and the revelations published during her trial are of the same kind. Such observations demonstrate how difficult it is to obtain such complete supervision as one would desire, and how skeptical one should remain before admitting the genuineness of diabolic attacks or apparitions. Here is another example which will show the extreme difficulty of observing certain phenomena too readily ascribed to the activity of the devil. Long before this last incident, there was a nun who, in the middle of the night, in the silence of the monastery, used to cause a great disturbance. Her cell suddenly resounded with strange noises and was sometimes filled with uproar. The bed table was violently overturned and crashed heavily on the carpet. A window pane was shattered. When this had happened several times, alarm was felt and the nuns tried to reconstruct the order of events. The complete disorder, the noise of the pane breaking, finally the fall of the nun, who was always found wrapped in her coverlet and hidden under her bed. She was supervised more and more strictly without any explanation being found of what happened in the silence of the night. The Mother Superior, the Superior General, and the sisters of the monastery all refused to believe that the evil one had any share in these stormy scenes. But how, it was asked, could anyone so completely wreck the furniture of her room and break a window pane before being found wrapped in her coverlet under her bed? A nun was put to watch her in the same room up to 4 o'clock in the morning. Nothing happened. But half an hour later, the uproar broke out as before. The superior general, wishing to clear up this mystery, spent the night in a room adjoining that of the self-styled victim of possession. In the middle of the night, suddenly the noise broke out. The superior rushed in, but it was too late. The scene was finished. And it is rather remarkable that there was nothing about this sister to show the slightest psychological unbalance. Modest, devout, sound in judgment, apparently open, this sister gave absolutely no sign which might have suggested possession or mythomania. Placed in a clinic, she preserved her serenity and always refused to give any explanation of the events which had disturbed the quiet of her monastery, other than the intervention of the demon. But after this, nothing abnormal ever disturbed the course of her nights. The case of Sybil. As the reader may have observed in the course of this work, the monopathic manifestations show a singular preference for the hours of night, when sleep invades the destined victim, detaching him from the outside world. For this reason, the patient very often wonders whether he has been dreaming. It was therefore with the greatest interest that I followed the developments of the supposedly diabolic manifestations in a woman who was referred to me by Friar de Tonquedec, a learned exorcist and an expert in matters of psychiatry. This patient's case, which I have described at length in my work devoted to the image of the body, is characterized by the following traits. About the age of 30, the most curious symptoms appeared. Almost every night, Sybil was carried by a sort of ecstasy or trance into a world which had nothing in common with the real one. It was, according to her expression, the world of the quote-unquote astral. In reality, the woman told us she felt herself divided into two parts during these trances. One, the earthly body, which stayed in her bed, the other, which was carried off into the astral. But though separated, these two halves of her personality were not unconnected, for the mischiefs to which the astral body was exposed were reflected in the real body. Justifiably alarmed at this doubling, as she called it, she went to consult an occultist who would give no explanation. Then, as a faithful Christian, she approached Friar de Tonquedec, who asked me to advise her. Sybil, an intelligent and lucid young woman who lived with her parents and helped with the housekeeping, told me on many occasions about the nocturnal phenomena she experienced. At my request, she wrote 2 exercise books in which the following incidents are described. After going to bed, determined to fall asleep, Sybil was carried away into what she called the astral. She took the name from a book picked up by chance from a bookstall on the quays. There, in the astral, her double suffered continuously the assaults and outrages of the demon. Whether the evil spirit appeared in its natural form, or disguised, or transformed into foul beasts, and especially snakes, it subjected her to the most humiliating, cynical, pestering, and even painful attacks. The devil forced her to enter a diabolic club where they abused her, giving her erotic sensations which she struggled by every means to avoid, but her will remained helpless. They burned her astral body, the double, and at once her earthly body felt the pain and the scorching. They abandoned themselves to truly satanic experiments on her. Thus, the demon appeared under the form of a bearded creature which beat her or sent her snakes, which entered her body. But it was the erotic assaults which mortified the poor girl unspeakably. The demon took her in its arms, violated her like a mortal man, and gave her sensations the more terrifying as they seemed the more delicious. Sometimes the devil disguised itself as a priest who made her suffer the same amorous tortures. Again, the demon tied her up to make her suffer, still in her astral double, burned her hair, threw her into a thorn bush, shot at her. Needless to say, in order to defend herself from these diabolic devices, Sybil invoked the protecting powers, God, Our Lady, the saints, and used countless means to chase the demon from her room. A brazier was placed under her bed or a piece of burnt sugar. 2 rosaries were round her arms. From time to time, she drank holy water so that her double might be restored to her. This idea of the dispossession of her own double was so strong and so real that one night, wishing to get up to leave her bed, she could only stand up, the greatest trouble, and tottered helplessly, her double having been taken from her. It is not surprising to learn that in spite of all these bodily cruelties inflicted on her by the evil spirit, it was always impossible to discover the slightest trace of tegumentary lesions. One day, however, Sybil sought me out to show me the authentic mark of the demon, the sigillum diaboli. Last night, Sybil told me, the demon launched a specially furious attack on me. It scratched my chest with its nails and claws, so that when my double came back, its application to my earthly body caused me frightful pain. Examining Sybil's chest, I was able to observe a very recent vesicular eruption of shingles in the region of the 5th and 6th left dorsal roots. There can be little doubt that in certain surroundings and at certain periods, this mark would have been thought significant. But Sybil's story appears even more interesting from another point of view, that of the origin of this psychopathy. At the age of 10, Sybil suffered from epidemic encephalitis. Treated in a Paris hospital, she was discharged, apparently cured, though she retained some slight character troubles. Still more remarkable, after these nocturnal troubles, which lasted for some years, her state rejoined her mother, who had suffered for years from dementia praecox, a disease to which she herself succumbed. I have compared the case of Sybil with the earlier ones, which are very different in nature, simply in order to make it clear that certain organic states are capable of producing very curious disturbances of the personality through the deceptions of dreams. Sybil was, of course, dreaming when her double was carried into the astral, but the dream here took on very individual characteristics. In spite of attempts from outside, Sybil did not recover contact with reality. I asked her father to observe her during these trance states, which was very easy, and he told me that his daughter, plunged in a sort of ecstasy, seemed positively wrapped out of the real world. Her eyes, though open, saw nothing outside her, while her gaze seemed to be directed by some inward representation, exactly as happens in sleepwalking. No doubt it would be extremely difficult and in fact impossible to realize for oneself the remarkably strange state into which Sybil plunged during her nights. As Charles Blondel has shown, a normal consciousness can never become capable of flowing into the mold of a morbid consciousness, short of becoming such itself, but the fact of it remains. It is obvious that nothing would be more unreal than to try to include in one formula the states of consciousness of these possessed persons. We may agree, however, that while the major paroxysms develop in a consciousness wholly detached from the links binding it to the external world, and even the memory of the picture of the crisis may vanish during the commonest attack, the patient does not fail to reveal himself as both spectator and actor in the same drama. While we need not have recourse to Freud's help to explore the unconscious or subliminal world of the possessed, we must clearly recognize that the imagery and dramatization characteristic of the demon's assaults are simply the expression of a desire or a fear. This explains the regular association in cases of this sort of eroticism and fear of the pains of hell, personified by the figure of the devil. We should properly add a second element, identification in suffering. Magdalene of the Cross, prioress of the Poor Clares of Cordova, did not shrink from self-crucifixion in order to identify herself with our Lord, just as she imagined, in the light of a disordered imagination, a state of diabolic pregnancy, all the more impressive in that it began on the Annunciation and ended at Christmas. With Sister Jean of the Angels, the neurotic pregnancy may be considered the consequence of her incessant interviews with the unfortunate exorcist who strove to expel from her body and soul the 7 demons which had entered into her, some of which were, in Leon Bloy's words, terrible gallants. Sister Jean, the victim of her imagination, found herself in an impasse. How could she escape from this situation as a pregnant woman after so positively stating and confirming it? Like those hysterical patients who get rid of a symptom which has become inconvenient, she took advantage of a great public exorcism to confound the doctor who had believed in her pregnancy and to astonish the public. For the demon was compelled to make me bring up through my mouth all the mass of blood he had accumulated in my body. The psychophysiological structure of the hysterical neurosis. To specify these morbid states, of which examples have been given, I have appealed to the notion of neurosis, or rather of psychoneurosis, and I have made use of the word hysteria. But what is hysteria? It is not just a myth, a collection of disparate and heterogeneous phenomena which has never been defined, for the simple reason that the greater proportion of the manifestations of what was called under Carcot the major neurosis is only illusion and simulation. As I have reminded readers, contrary to an opinion too widely held, even in medical circles unconnected with neurology, hysteria is very far from dead. Many examples of it are observed in our time, and though they are perhaps less spectacular than in the hectic days of the Salpêtrière, that is because we now understand better the inner nature of the neurosis and make use of better means to confine its manifestations and disperse them quickly. Admittedly, hysteria cannot be regarded as an illness in the strict sense of the word, like tuberculosis, typhoid, or some organic affection such as the word illness suggests. Hysteria must not be envisaged in the abstract, but like life itself, in the concrete. What the neurologist observes is simply an aggregation of symptoms and particular reactions experienced by a particular person placed in certain conditions. Briefly, the symptoms we call hysterical correspond with a definite psychosomatic state which may remain latent during a long life and only be brought into the light of day by social disturbances. Hysterical reactions are of an order which is social, ideological, or of the family. To be produced, they require a certain moral climate and social setting. Isolated on an island like Robinson Crusoe's, neurotic hysterical reactions would be inconceivable. And it is precisely to the great social upheaval in the storm which burst on the Western world during 1914 through 18 that we owe indisputably the recrudescence of the revival of that major hysteria, which had remained hidden during the days of political and religious peace. The scale of this work does not admit of an exhaustive study of the hysterical psychoneurosis, for that would require too long an elaboration. We need only say that hysterical reactions, however diverse they may appear to observation, respond to a particular structure. Generally speaking, hysterical phenomena indicate a frail psychological organism, which is usually weak in the field of self-criticism and judgment. Experience of the World War of 1914 through 18, in which France played such a considerable part, showed us that the patients subject to hysterical attacks or symptoms belong to educated social classes. When Henry Claude and I drew up the results of our very numerous observations, we came to the conclusion that while hysterical manifestations were frequent among farmers, peasants, and country people, they never came to our notice among officers and doctors, though among both these classes, cases of pretense were sometimes detected. Hysterical reactions, in fact, respond to a primitive mentality which has not reached the stage of criticism. And that is why history shows us that these phenomena are frequent in all ages, even the remotest of our civilization. Thus, the symptoms of this psychoneurosis correspond with a regression towards the infantile stage of the moral personality, with a dissociation of the psychological elements which should hold it together. One idea or sentiment predominates, and this seems to extinguish the other constituents of the psyche. One part of the personality escapes from the control of criticism and seems to be no longer attached to the self. It is this fairly simple mechanism that produces paralysis, contractures, spasms, grotesque, and often very uncomfortable attitudes, which the patient sometimes keeps up for years if treatment is not given in time. In this way, also arise those sensitive sensorial disorders, which are so common that they have been often considered the real hallmarks of the neurosis: anesthesia, analgesia, deafness, or blindness. It is an odd fact, but the hysterical patient never complains of some serious symptom or other which must be making him suffer. He never goes to the doctor to ask advice or help. Indifferent, he seems to have lost the sense of a function, whether sensitive, sensorial, motor, or even visceral. But if some serious incident occurs which might threaten the safety of his life, the patient suddenly recovers the vanished function, thus giving to unlearned minds the impression of a miracle. What has really happened? The primordial instinct of self-preservation has come into play, destroying in a moment all the fragile constructions of an unregulated imagination. As all observers of the psychoneurosis have clearly noted, the fundamental element of hysteria responds to an elementary imaginative process released by suggestion. Whether it is heterosuggestion or autosuggestion, the result is the same: the disjunction of one part of the personality, the escape of a physiological function from control. As Pierre Janet emphasized at length, hysterical manifestations always bear the mark of psychological insufficiency, of retreat from the field of consciousness, of reduction of the mental synthesis, so that a division is set up, a schism in the personality, which may lead to a genuine illness. And this, by its progressive evolution, will result in a psychological collapse, schizophrenia, or dementia praecox. I ought here to remark that many pseudo-demoniacs who have come under my observation have fallen sooner or later into schizophrenia. Hysteria could then be considered as a schizosis, that is, a psychological affection with psychosomatic characteristics determined by the dissociation of the self or of the conscious personality. This also suggests the considerable role played by the subconscious psyche in determining the accidents of hysteria, and the great importance for our problem of the discoveries of Sigmund Freud. In the last analysis, as Carcott wrote about the works of his collaborator, Pierre Janet, these studies simply confirm a thought expressed in our lectures, that hysteria is very largely a mental illness. The term mental illness is perhaps too strong. Nowadays, we should prefer to call it an illness generating psychosomatic process, insinuating itself into a psyche which is frail and particularly sensitive to all suggestions, whether these come from outside or derive their origin from subconscious or unconscious factors which many people have within them. These may be unknown or virtual, but catastrophes or some favorable moral climate can bring them up into light, to the astonishment of others who are insufficiently informed. To these considerations, we must add some reflections more peculiar to our subject. To many theologians, the application of the term hysteria leads to a disparaging interpretation of the facts. And though the ancient idea of hysteria neurosis engendered by eros is abandoned, the fact remains that the hysterical subject is considered a simulator, a super simulator, according to the expression current during the First Great War. On a superficial examination, no doubt, it might appear that anybody could reproduce all the symptoms of hysteria, provided he wished to. But this is not the case. The symptoms of hysteria, whether they be the major convulsive attacks, paralysis, contractures of anesthesia, cannot now be held to be artificial, that is, the products of a willingly consented simulation. It is impossible for a normal subject to reproduce them completely in their total reality and permanence. We are not unaware, however, that the reactions proper to hysteria may be accompanied by a special psychological state which has been brought to light by the great psychiatrist Ernest Dupree and is called mythomania, the tendency to make believe, to the creation of untrue romances and lying statements. Already in his lectures, Charcot had denounced the tendency of hysterical patients to duplicity, which shows that only a specially critical and informed mind is capable of detecting fraud among the genuine phenomena of the psychoneurosis. But this granted, it must certainly be said that, on the one hand, mythomania corresponds to a pathological state and not to deliberate falsehood, and on the other hand, that the most certainly hysterical symptoms can coexist with the highest virtues and a life worthy of admiration and respect. as the life of Marie Therese Noblet, among others, bears witness. Hysterical patients, like all other sick people, deserve our understanding and our charity. Chapter 3, the lucid form of pseudo-diabolic possession. In the preceding chapters, I have explained the different aspects under which paroxysmal or cataclysmal possessions appear. The normal personality here alternates with that of the demon. One takes the place of the other, although they are not unaware of each other. Or how could the possessed person think that an alien being is showing itself in him? As I have mentioned, however, there are cases in which the possessed seems to be invested simultaneously with two personalities, the normal and the demoniacal. But this is only an illusion, and patients of this type behave exactly like actors who soliloquize before an astounded audience. In the form now to be described, the demoniacal control is permanent. While they speak to you, these patients have no doubt that they are penetrated by the evil spirit. So in the same mind, they coexist two personalities who hate and fight each other bitterly. It has been my lot to observe several cases which reveal this false possession, and I have tried to show that the psychological mechanism active in cases of this sort proves to be of exactly the same kind as that which the psychiatrist discovers at the source of pathological mental automatism. I can give a striking example of this. A man about 60, for many years a civil servant in one of the ministries, came to consult me on the advice of an exorcist who had at once guessed the nature of his disease. This man, whose external conduct was unimpeachable, told me that for a long time past, he had felt himself to be manipulated, possessed by the demon. This diabolical control was something of which he was absolutely convinced. To begin with, he heard sounding in himself offensive, substantial, and filthy words. Ironical thoughts came to his mind, applying to the most respectable persons. Soon the devil threatened him. If you advance, you are dead, Satan said to him. I shall summon all the legions of hell against you. Later, the devil caused him to see scenes of perverse immorality, the more repugnant because he was forced to witness persons in postures of homosexuality or connected with nymphomania. Everything around him became a pretext for symbolization. The devil stayed near him in image, at the same time gliding into his inner self to reveal or recall things which horrified him. This influence of the evil spirit left him no respite, while it entailed a constant restraint over his thoughts and actions. Dialogues took place between the demon within him and his own personality, in the course of which the devil was irritated if he opposed, mocked, or threatened him. My patient, a man of great intelligence, explained to me how, if he resisted by taking refuge in silence, the devil would formulate in succession both questions and answers. More than that, it provoked a sort of automatic language. Words formed themselves on his lips without the consent of his own will, giving an impression of spurious possession. And in this inner conflict against the diabolical control, my patient got to the point of wondering whether the devil, so cunning and subtle, were not trying to make him believe in a real possession. Could not the feeling of domination he experienced be compared to a sort of induced current? However that might be, he was certain that the evil spirit made him think, feel, and act in a manner repugnant to him, striving to bring out a rupture of union of thought and heart with the powers he invoked, meaning, of course, the celestial powers. But it must not be supposed that the devil confined itself to acting on his mind, thoughts, and feelings. It influenced and regulated his physiological behavior. Thus, the patient would suddenly feel an irresistible desire to sleep, while with his lips he rejected the malign internal whisper. In addition, there were attacks on the head, the optic nerve, and the pineal gland, and one suspects the genital organs, in a frequent state of nervous excitement or emotion. As I was given to understand, the man tried to every possible means, physical, psychological, and spiritual, to combat the demoniacal influence. In what he called his mental defenses, he included silence, self exorcism, prayer to the Archangel Michael, and recourse to three powers: Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus, and our Blessed Lady. With a little attention, the possessed man continues. The division takes place. One sees nothing more. Everything happens as if the evil spirit were arrested and forbidden to perverse. Above all, one must never compromise. I have here recorded only some of the more expressive marks of the psychosis with which this possessed man was afflicted. But the remarkable thing is the result of the auto-analysis to which the man abandoned himself. From all the evidence, he did not doubt that the devil acted on him in all sorts of ways, making him experience repugnant sentiments, to think and act against his will and in opposition to his true self. But he asked himself, am I really possessed by the devil? Is it not trying to impose on me the conviction of a possession which is not real? Certainly, he wrote, I am the victim of the devil's malice at the same time as I am benefiting from the support of the divine powers. But after all, in what manner can the evil spirit act? By influencing my thoughts, by distorting my actions, by suspending a part of my social activity, by making me hear locutions which are abject, ignoble, obscene, etc. All this I can well understand, but might not the devil have a still more subtle mode of action? I mean, not by unhinging or disowning my brain, but by producing the semblance of a psychoneurosis. It could be noticed that the subject never in any way envisages being attacked by a mental affliction. He only wonders whether the repeated diagnosis of his state as psychoneurosis is not in reality a delusive appearance created by the cunning, the hypocritical ruse of the evil spirit. The case I have recorded is far from exceptional, and I have observed others like it, but I have studied it in such detail because it here appears in its pure state, so to speak, and enables us to understand the tragic series of events of which Friar Surin was the victim at Loudun. The case of Friar Surin. The strange behavior of this great mystic, the exorcist of Sister Jean of the Angels, was the subject of many commentaries, and many attempts have been made to diagnose the remarkable psychological anomaly of the author of the Spiritual Catechism and the Spiritual Dialogues. Exactly as with the patient I have been describing, the very obvious disorder in the psychological sphere did not weaken his higher functions, and it cannot be too often emphasized that it was at the end of his life that Friar Surin wrote his finest works. We are faced then with a mystery rather similar to that which still surrounds the personality of Hamlet. Was Friar Surin a lunatic or a man possessed by the devil? Without question, from the day when Friar Serin assumed the functions of exorcist to Jean of the Angels, his life began to abound in singularities. It is equally obvious that no temperament could have been less suited to this role than that of the Jesuit father, transported into a world which was feverish and profoundly disturbed by the growing number of possessed persons whose nervous state, writes Friar Polaine, was spreading like an infectious disease. All the churches of Loudun, confessed Friar Serin, were occupied by the exorcist, and a prodigious crowd of people watched what was happening. There was not one who was not obsessed, and I myself was the very first. It is therefore not surprising to learn from Friar Serin himself that he was assailed by temptations to such appalling impurities that without a miraculous grace he could never have defended himself. But despite his every effort to escape the power of the demon, he was obliged to succumb to it. Not only did the devil publicly possess him, a minister of the church, but again when Leviathan, at his command, left Sister Jean's body, it entered his own. Then the mother became very calm, and I ceased to be so. In spite of the strangeness of the phenomena and their danger, the exorcisms of Sister Jean continued. And in 1635, when the Friar Serin was 35 years old, all those symptoms appeared which I witnessed in that girl whose tragic trials I reported. The demon which possessed him was chiefly that of impurity. It provoked in him sensations and natural representations of such violence that the temptation almost drove him mad. The wretched Friar Serin could not help persuading himself that it was no longer he who ruled his conduct, but a detestable being inside him, commanding his ideas and actions. For every day the devils were active in the bodies of most of the Ursulines, and Sister Jean, his penitent, confided to him her most tender ravishments, at the same time aping that demoniacal display which was most likely to overexcite the imagination. Very soon, it seems, the idea of diabolic influence invaded Friar Serin's mind, so as to transform or confirm it in the conviction that he was possessed. He describes the mechanism of this state as he understands it. Writing to a friend in the Society of Jesus, he says, I cannot explain what happens within me and how this spirit, the evil one, unites himself with me without depriving me either of my liberty or of my consciousness. He becomes nonetheless like another self. It is then as if I had two souls, one of which is deprived of the use of its bodily organs and remains afar off, watching the actions of the one which has taken possession of the body, while this other acts in the body as if it were its master. I feel that the Spirit of God and the spirit of the demon are using my body and soul as a battlefield, and each makes his own impressions on it. On the demon's part, they are of rage and aversion from God, giving me an impetuous desire to be separated from him forever, and at the same time, I experience a great sweetness, profound peace, heavenly joy. I feel the state of damnation and apprehended, and this stranger soul, which seems to be mine, is penetrated with despair as though by arrows, while the other soul, which is full of faith, despises these impressions and freely curses him who causes them. Indeed, I feel that the same cries which escape my lips come equally from these two souls, and I am at pains to tell whether they are produced by joy or by the extreme madness which fills me. Inspired by two such opposed principles, Friar Seren could not fail to be very singular in his behavior, so he was judged by his fellow Jesuits to be infirmus and even placed under supervision at Saint Macaire. On this point again, this man who was so obsessed with possession provides us with the most explicit details. He writes, if at the intervention of one of these souls, I wish to make the sign of the cross on my lips, the other forcibly snatches my hand away and seizes my finger with my teeth to bite me with fury. We need not, I think, dwell on the very numerous psychical and psychosensory hallucinations from which Friar Seren suffered, for these were very similar to those of my former patient. What is chiefly important in either case is the profound sense of a division of the personality into two halves, one of which the subject attributes to himself and is what he would wish to be, while the other is that which possesses him in spite of himself, which constrains and directs him, and from which he longs at any price to be free. I could report many other personal observations, but Christian discretion obliges me not to publish them. Nonetheless, one feels a very natural astonishment at the preservation of the intellectual functions in cases of this sort. I may briefly mention what I observed in a patient over a period of more than 10 years. A man who likewise believed he was possessed by the devil. Like Seren, this man had begun by feeling that a force was being exerted over him. Then the impression of constraint became more vivid, and soon he persuaded himself that the devil was inside him, acting on his physical and moral personality. In this man, the devil was not felt or conceived merely as the evil spirit, it was materialized. The patient felt it in his body. More than that, he used to vomit it or spit it out, and when the devil went out of his mouth, he felt burning or a taste of sulfur on his lips, or the pain of claws or nails scratching his lips. Now, in spite of such a well-established, deeply rooted delirium, and in spite of this split of the personality, this patient always retained a lively intelligence and appeared able, without anyone noticing anything strange, to carry on uninterruptedly a brilliant course of teaching. The psychological structure of lucid possession. The facts I have sketched oblige us now to face the question of the mechanism which regulates and determines this type of pseudo-demoniacal possession. For there to be an appearance of possession, the subject must experience the feeling of being constrained in both thought and action by a power stronger than himself. He must feel himself both possessed by a power and dispossessed of his liberty. This is precisely the feeling and the idea we find expounded in the writings of Friar Seren and in the notebooks written by my patient, whose sad story I have recorded. Neither hesitates to conclude that his being is shared between two personalities. Is it then possible to hold that the self can ever be divided by a pathological process? To the theologian, Ostrich says, the reality of an inner division in the state of possession is clearly evident, and he quotes Harnack. The patient's consciousness, as he professes, his will and sphere of activity are duplicated. He has the impression that there is within him a second being which dominates and governs him. He thinks, feels, and acts now as the one, now as the other, and with the conviction that he is dual. It could not be better expressed. But must we conclude that the self is really divided? Are we not in the presence of an illusion? Osterreich very pertinently remarks that on this hypothesis, we must either believe in the conditioned appearance of a new subject bearing no relation at all to the first, the normal one, or else in a real division of the first subject, the real self. However, he continues, if there is a division of the subject, we have therefore two series of psychic processes. The one belongs to the one subject, the other to the other. Neither of the two possesses an immediate knowledge of the other. And later he says, if the subject is something absolute, not only from the point of view of functions or composition, but as constituting a unity in itself and for itself, its division is in every way impossible, particularly if it must be effected without change. The philosophical argument is based on strict logic, and it is certain that two absolutely pure selves cannot coexist in our possessed patients. But granting this, we are bound to defer to what is asserted by all our subjects, who feel in themselves a dual center of thoughts and feelings and a dual source of activity. As a possessed patient studied by L. and J. Garrell says, my being seems to me to be cut in two. The being who judges and has love and respect for everyone, and the being who is judged and is gradually degraded. Pierre Janet goes further. Though he does not completely resolve the difficulty, man is subject to subconscious dreams produced by automatic acts. If the mind is weakened, these automatic dreams develop and become defined, then involuntary, and soon there is duplication. The patient attributes his trouble to one influence or another, and in some cases to the devil. St. John of the Cross, in his critical analysis of the imaginary or successive words so common with certain mystics, proved even shrewder in denouncing the facility with which the man who retreats into himself and indulges in contemplation can imagine that he is not the author of the words he hears interiorly, and persuades himself that it is another person who forms these reasonings within himself. Under the influence of subconscious feelings and the pressure of coenaesthetic disturbances, the mind may then be capable of creating a system of thoughts and affective elements which, because of their affinity and common origin in the depths of the subconscious, unite to form a complex whole of which the subject, though unconsciously, is the creator, and which appears to be a dual personality. In reality, the self cannot be duplicated, divided, split, but it can experience the illusion of it. Because this second personality seems either to have a divine appearance, as with the false mystics, or to be so opposed to what the subject desires to be that he can only imagine it to be diabolical. We should note that this apparent splitting is not peculiar to pseudo mystics or possessed persons, but appears very obviously in many who suffer from persecution mania or similar afflictions, as well as in spiritualists in trance. The patient presented by G. de Clairvaux at the beginning of his clinical researches into mental automatism clearly displayed this mechanism. This woman, who was not haunted by any religious ideas, declared that she was given ideas which were not her own, that there arose in her mind depressions or absurdities of which she could not discover the source. This mysterious power which possessed her, which disorganized her brain, what could it be? Perhaps some discarnate spirit, she thought. It is rather remarkable, by the way, that possession by spirits has increased in proportion with the modern growth of the so-called science of spiritualism, and has multiplied the more as demonopathic possession has decreased. But to return to the problem of dual personality, according to De Clarenbolt, there is a group of psychopathies which are based on the splitting of the personality so that the subject has the illusion that he is formed of two entities, different and utterly opposed, one in which he recognizes himself, the other which he energetically repudiates. The personality, primus, in De Clarenbolt's terminology, wants to be the social personality, the one the subject has constructed for himself. The personality, secundus, sprung, I repeat, from the subconscious activity, provides the subject with information on what is going on in the deepest region of the psyche, the intellectual and affective subconscious. But the secundus, which is often revealed to be megalomaniac, sarcastic, pestering, hypersexual, or perverted, provokes an often violent reaction on the part of the primus, who tries to be every possible means to correct the faults of the secundus, so as to impose its law on it. Now, this throwback can only rebound on the secundus, which retorts with insults or sarcasms, and so there are interminable soliloquies and exhausting vicious circles. Accordingly, while there is no real division of the self seems to be faced with an elusive artificial personality, which it has itself constructed but does not recognize. And when the Christian patient is filled with the fear or horror of bad thoughts, he easily slips from the scruple of obsession to the delirium of possession by materializing in the diabolical being the representations, feelings, and tendencies which he detests and wishes at all costs to reject. The subject of false demoniacal possession is too vast for me to pretend to have given a complete picture of such a complex state. I have merely tried to define the most striking features of the two fundamental types of this affliction. The cataclysmal or intermittent and the lucid or continuous, the reader will easily understand that these two types do not in themselves constitute illnesses, but simply syndromes. These may figure as component elements in a great number of mental illnesses, which it is the task of the psychiatrist to differentiate. And since the possessions have envisaged correspond to natural psychophysiological mechanisms, the doctor must not find himself defenseless against these manifestations. From the preventive point of view, he must be aware of any ill-advised suggestion, for imaginary possession is one of the most easily induced maladies. Exorcism, that dangerous ministry, must never become an ill-considered or imprudent practice, and it must be remembered that if one calls up the devil, one will see not the devil himself, but a portrait composed according to the patient's idea of him. Antoine Gay, the possessed worshiper. As the gospel stories clearly show, neither the demons nor Satan, their master, are in the habit, when they take possession of a man, of making him say prayers or inciting him to pronounce thanksgivings and even to praise God or Our Lady. The story of a historical character, Antoine Gay, who believed himself to be possessed, therefore deserves some consideration. Born on May 31st, 1790 in the Ain department, Antoine had a rudimentary education and learned the trade of a joiner. In about his 30th year, he made a vow to enter religion and even received the habit of a lay brother. But soon, troubled with a nervous affliction, he was unable to satisfy the demands of the monastic life. Exactly what the nervous disorder was which prevented him following the rule, we do not know, though this may be guessed in the course of his story. At the age of 47, Antoine appeared to show indubitable signs of possession, and thereafter the trouble only increased. 3 demons, writes M. Gruninger, had taken up their abode in his body. Ezacharon, prince of the demons of impurity, and 2 others, one of lying, the other of avarice, called the dog and the wolf. Thus, the possessed man barked like a dog, howled like a wolf, and grunted like a pig. His friends, out of pity, sent him back to the Trappist monastery of Aguaville, provided with certificates from priests and doctors. Although, we are assured, the abbot was convinced that the possession was genuine, he did not consider it prudent or necessary to use exorcism and referred him to his friend, the chaplain of the brothers at Previs. He stayed there for 3 weeks, but here too he was not subjected to any exorcism. The poor man then returned to Lyons to practice his trade as a joiner. But then the people became alarmed. Was this gesticulating, abusive demoniac to be allowed at large, even if he were not actually dangerous? Judged to be a lunatic, Antoine was then admitted to Antequil, an old hospital in Lyons, where he remained for 3 months. When discharged, our possessed friend attracted the sympathy of 2 worthy priests who introduced him to Cardinal de Bonald, the Archbishop of the diocese. But after reading a letter from Antoine requesting the favor of an exorcism, the cardinal confined himself to giving a few words of consolation. To mitigate this fresh disappointment, a priest, Friar Marie Joseph Chiron, decided to devote himself to comforting poor Antoine, who took the habit of the 3rd order and became Brother Joseph Marie. In 1853, Friar Chiron accompanied him to the monastery of Bernay-les-Bains, still hoping to obtain the favor of an exorcism. But note this, what led Friar Chiron to go near Perpignan was not only his desire to obtain Antoine's deliverance from possession, but also his interest in a possessed woman, mother of 3 children. The whole parish had seen her running extremely fast, and nobody doubted the reality of a diabolic power, for she was raised about 2 feet above the ground. Now, while Friar Chiron was in the house of this unfortunate woman, somebody brought him a young woman called Chiquette, 36 years old, who since the age of 16 had been stricken by the demon with dumbness. But if Chiquette was incapable of speech, the demon inside her, which answered to the name of Modeste, was certainly not. And so Chiquette and Antoine, thus brought together, lost no time in exteriorizing their possession. The demons, Modeste and Ezacharon, we are told, were like mad dogs. They spoke a language, wrote Friar Chiron, of which we understand nothing. They insulted and humiliated each other, and I was often obliged to intervene to prevent them coming to blows. Apart from possession, he continues, such things are inexplicable. Returning to Lyons, Antoine again begged for the favor of exorcism, but in vain. Life at Lyons did not proceed without vexatious manifestations on his part, for he was taken 7 times to the preventive cell at the Hotel de Ville of Lyons and detained 4 times at the old prison called Rouen. The unfortunate man's afflictions were indeed most painful. Issacharon inflicted on him not only atrocious bodily pains, but also appalling moral tortures. As a fervent Christian, he desired with all his heart to perform his religious duties and by his humility, prayers, and devotions to obtain some relief from his martyrdom. But now the demon forbade him to attend the services of the church or to go to confession. You shall not confess till I have left your body. There has never been a possession like this, and there will never be another, he whispered. Antoine became desperate at seeing that nothing could be done to relieve his afflictions. The world is taking the demon's side, he wrote. Already we see a rather revealing mark of the persecution complex which gripped our poor hero, and this was still accentuated by a matter of family inheritance. He thought that his sisters were trying to divert some family property to their own advantage, and that the judges of the case had shown scandalous partiality. The internal agitation tormenting this poor man did not fail to show itself in his strange behavior. Children avoided him or jeered at him, calling him Gardavo. He lived apart. At last, in spite of his appeals, and in spite of the efforts of the religious and priests who supported him, the exorcists refused their help, and on his deathbed, Antoine found it impossible to make his confession. Issacharon made him dumb. The evil spirit never ceased to repeat, not before exorcism. Such, in brief outline, is the tragic story of a poor man whom some still hold to have been a genuine case of possession by the devil. Alleged proofs are certainly not lacking. Discernment of spirits, clairvoyance, premonitions, sight of the future, inexplicable cures, reading of people's hearts. I know all the inhabitants of the earth, he declared emphatically. Theological and linguistic knowledge, and these do not exhaust the list. But though we are swamped with the facts offered as proofs of the authenticity of the possession, I should have preferred some substantial documentation, some observation carried out by qualified persons, and not simply by those who may have been very good men, but were quite without psychological or medical competence. If Antoine Gay could really have been considered a genuinely possessed man, how was it that the highest and most competent authorities of the church always refused, in spite of the most urgent pleas, to apply the exorcism for which the wretched man so longed, and which seemed the only remedy for a hopeless situation? No. As those well informed and instructed in questions of the demonopathy perfectly understood, Antoine was not genuinely possessed. His case is one of the category of lucid delirious possession, of one suffering from paranoid persecution mania, and of very weak critical intelligence. The reason why we have dealt with this case at such length is that in this unfortunate, divided against himself, Issacharon, as he thought, having gained hold of his personality, never ceased to praise God and the Blessed Virgin. The evil spirit, in truth, here appears in the guise of an apostolic devil, which surely seems paradoxical enough. No doubt, as M. Gruninger writes, it was only in self-defense that this demon filled this role, but he often did so with a zeal which a holy missionary would not have disavowed, and a talent which many preachers would envy. Sovereign Master, one and only God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, creator of all things save sin, of which Satan is the inventor. God of goodness, wisdom, power, and infinite mercy. Thou art he who was before time, who is and ever shall be, of whom we demons are all the accursed slaves, and whom I, Zacharon, obey by force against all hell to exclaim against the disorders which fill the world. Oh God, infinitely great, infinitely holy, infinitely just, infinitely good. Thou dost not despise the most miserable of thy creatures. What have I done to deserve the graces thou givest me, unworthy as I am? Would I had tears of blood to bewail all my ingratitude and all the offenses I have had the misfortune to commit against thee. To him the glory of the Holy Virgin. As Zacharon becomes sublime, continues M. Greninger. No tongue can praise the Mother of God as she deserves. No creature can comprehend her greatness, her goodness, and her power. Mary alone has more strength than all the angels, all creatures, all the saints together. Those who refuse to believe in her virginity, her motherhood, her immaculate conception will perish eternally. I may be excused for not being struck with amazement at the productions of an alleged evil spirit who only repeats in an emphatic and grandiloquent fashion all that has been said and written more soberly by the pastors, the preachers, and the authors of our catechism. Chapter 4, Witchcraft and Diabolic Possession. In our own days, we scarcely ever come across sorcerers, but it was very different in the Middle Ages or even in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the history of sorcery or witchcraft throws much light on the subject of demoniacal possession. In the first place, we must remember that the sorcerer is not to be confused with the magician. The magician acts on those who resort to him by using processes unknown to science and repugnant to it, but the devil is not necessarily involved. The sorcerer, on the contrary, is a person whose influence is exerted through the medium of the demon. So, whether the evil spirit is invoked from without, as in external demonopathy, or from within, as in genuine demoniacal possession, the result is the same. It is always the supposed power of the demon which comes into action. So, as M. Amadou rightly reminds us, if the sorcerer is genuinely possessed, he does not permanently remain so. On the other hand, he facilitates the intervention of the demon by prayers, invocations, incantations, and a whole set of magic means, even by material technical processes such as fomentations or technical ointments. The sexual intercourse of the possessed, this should be good, which we observe in our days is wholly involuntary. The incubus and the succuba are both subjected to it, whereas wizard and witch invite it, desire it, share it, and approve it with all their hearts. These are the essential characteristics of the sorcerer as distinct from the possessed. In reality, we must admit that while there is this delicate distinction between sorcerers and possessed, we cannot see any formal contradiction between these two modes of demonopathy. Equally, it is not forbidden to look for a natural explanation of each of these modes, saving always, of course, our belief in the real influence of Satan in the world. We need not remind our readers that the church has always taken the same attitude towards sorcerers who invoke the devil as towards those she considers to be genuinely possessed. Granting these general principles, we can examine the singular manifestations which history attributes to the sorcerers, those henchmen of the devil. We shall not find them in works on psychology or mental medicine, but in the judicial records, for wizards or witches have been the chief figures in countless trials. We owe a debt of special gratitude to such an archivist as M. Etienne del Cambre, who, with unwearying patience and absolute objectivity, has undertaken the task of expounding in detail the witchcraft trials which occurred in the Duchy of Lorraine in the 16th and 17th centuries. I point out at once that the facts reported by this author are not peculiar to the history of this region. The same scenes were enacted before the tribunals of far distant provinces, and if we examine them attentively, we always find the same procedure, so that a single explanation can be valid for the witchcraft of Languedoc, of Poitou, and of Lorraine. As I have mentioned, the sorcerer invokes the demon and asks for help. More, he tries to be united to him, so that it has been said that witchcraft is simply an inverted mysticism. That is why some theologians have depicted it like a diptych, the divine mysticism and the diabolical. So we need not be surprised that the behavior of the sorcerer resembles some of the points which strike us in some false mystics. Imaginary or corporeal visions, auditions, the feeling of being influenced, the apparent splitting of the personality are found in the sorcerers as well as in the possessed demoniacs. This fact is of considerable importance, for it allows us to suppose that one and the same element is to be found at the root of witchcraft and at that of the false possessions. And that is what we must now try to discover. We know how powerfully and earnestly the great Christian mystics, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Jesus, and others, not to mention the pure mystics of the Eastern churches, have taught that we must refuse to accept everything presented to us by the senses. Now, with the sorcerer, the pretended influence of the demon relies precisely on so-called corporeal phenomena, while the sentiment of an immaterial presence is common with the mystic, and the feeling of an influence often haunts the possessed. The mind of the sorcerer is peopled with phenomena which are purely corporeal, that is, palpable to the senses. The demon is not felt as an evil spirit, but shows itself under the most hideous and always repugnant forms, a feline or canine appearance, horrible to behold, infesting the atmosphere with a nauseous stench. In the case of a witch, the devil visits her in the form of a goat, a howling wolf, a terrifying bull, a rat, a hare, a snake, a lizard, or even beasts impossible to identify but grossly obvious in their symbolical significance. With the wizard, the diabolic forms resemble those of a woman, either under the aspect of a perverted or alluring Eve, or in the guise of caressing animals, or of mobile shadows subject to strange metamorphosis, or of mysterious fire, mobile and blue. Generally, the corporeal visions are not seen by the sorcerer's companions, though this rule has its exceptions, which, as we may guess, greatly increase the credibility accorded to the satanic apparitions. But these apparitions, often accompanied by foul smells, seem to the sorcerer a strong proof of the presence of the evil one. Further, The proof of the devil's reality is revealed, it seems, by the accompaniment of audible words. The diabolical apparitions are not only apparent to sight and smell, there are some which whisper, speak into the ear, or howl. Thus, Nicholas Remy reports, when Satan desires to transmit a secret message to one of his servants, he changes himself into a little fly which murmurs in his ear. No doubt the demon can be clever at disguise and hide its presence under the form of an animal of normal appearance, but it is recognized by the absence of a tail. It is interesting to observe that certain possessed persons in our own day, haunted by visits from the demon, declare that it must most often appears in a human form, but betrays itself by the lack of a tail, and also by its disappearing when sprinkled with holy water or exposed to some sacramental, like the sign of the cross. In time of trial, and especially in imprisonment, the demon's visits become more frequent and painful. Its influence over the prisoner is such that the latter can transport himself in spirit to another place, crossing the walls of the prison to visit distant persons and places. It was by such a satanic intervention, Dale Camber reports, that the magistrates of Charmes exclaimed the apparition of a witch. The demon, in the judge's opinion, must have transported her in ecstasy outside the prison. How else could it be explained, they said, that being a prisoner in this castle, she can see a woman who is in her home or elsewhere? The hypothesis of a dream or rapture in spirit being discarded, the fact of a bodily transporting, seemed to the magistrates the only plausible explanation of such an appearance in such a place. It is noteworthy that the visits of the demon to the prison where the witches are incarcerated do not always bring fear, sadness, or affliction. More than once, we are told, the devil cheers his servant with the hope of a speedy release if the secret is well kept. In case the accused has already started to make confessions, he compels her to retract and persuades her that by such a disavowal, she will escape the clutches of the law. The devil's attentions may include cheering the unfortunate women with his bodily presence or even having carnal intercourse with them. Stubborn in his decisions and his control over his henchmen, the demon accompanies his slaves to the dock and during the torture. According to Nicholas Remy, Satan is more assiduous than ever and does not hesitate to appear to his slaves in the very sanctum of justice, among the bench of judges. Belief in Satan's personification is so deep that Remy is astonished at not being able to see him when a prisoner pointed him out with his finger, and the worthy man is convinced that he himself was the object of a diabolic enchantment, preventing him from seeing Satan, who was visible only to his servants. With great good sense, Etienne del Camber considers that the myth of internal visions in all periods arises from a pathological deviation of the mental functions, whether it is a case of obsession or persecution mania or of simple hysteria, and that all the strange phenomena we have reported can only have been aggravated during the imprisonment and the trial and during the pangs of torture. The author adds that in this field, mystical theology has exerted a definite influence. Clarifying his thought, Dale Camber is careful to add that the supposedly satanic phenomena reproduce only the lowest, as it were material, form of the mystical experience. between certain visions of Saint Teresa of Jesus or a Saint John of the Cross and those claimed to have seen by the vampires of Lorraine and the West, we find a difference not only of content but also of nature. So then, the wizard appears as essentially subordinated to the demon's pleasure. Worse, he becomes the slave of an inexorable master, a mysterious creature whose yoke is as burdensome as that of Christ is light. A witch of Brouvelures declares that since she gave herself to the demon, instead of receiving any courtesy, nothing but ill fortune and poverty has befallen her. On the pattern of the possessed, the wizard receives from his master imperative orders, forbidding him to pray to God, to implore God's help, to go to church, and especially to put his trust in the Almighty by prayer and charity. Forbidden too are the sacramentals and the sacraments, and above all, the blessed sacrament. But a very peculiar point. It is not so much the idea of bad dispositions in the soul which haunts the wizard as the material profanation of the Eucharistic body. That is why amateurs of Satanism, beginning with Huysmans in La Basse, has delighted to describe black masses, sacrilegious, and profanations under realistic colors, which are incidentally the most suited to the resources of an art which considers itself naturalistic. Satan threatens, commands his slaves imperiously, obliges them to do evil, to eschew all that comes from God, and therefore sometimes to kill their neighbors or destroy themselves. Thus, the demon orders a wizard of Père in Moyen-Morsher to kill his own wife. The wretch refuses and is tempted to suicide. An accused woman at Eterol is given the formal injunction to kill her husband. Refusing this order, the poor woman pays for her disobedience with a long illness. Some of those vampires who had refused to obey the orders of the fiend were beaten till their bodies were covered with bruises. Sometimes it is not only by a kind of intuition that the vampire or wizard is invited to commit suicide or murder. The order is conveyed by a voice which cries, kill yourself, or kill him, kill him. Nowadays, we can observe absolutely identical phenomena in our cases of possession. One of my patients, for example, during a state of depression, heard the devil in the middle of the night speaking to her and bidding her kill her child, then a few months old. The woman whose child slept beside her was horrified and indignant, and for several nights merely told her husband the orders the demon had bidden her to carry out. But one night she suddenly woke up in a state of anxiety. The demon whispered in her ear, kill it, then kill it. After a few short moments of resistance, the poor woman got up, took her child in its cradle, and threw it out of the window from the second floor. A good guardian angel no doubt intervened. The child was bruised but not killed. As for the mother, when she had been given electrical shock treatment, she was not long in recovering her mental equilibrium. The facts of which I have given the most essential traits show that in principle, the vampires and sorcerers who are the devil's slaves have sought his assistance voluntarily, while the possessed are forced to endure the moral tortures of the evil one and beg to be delivered from his power. But they also show that in actual fact that there is only a frail barrier between these two classes of slaves to the devil's power. From the social, prophylactic and therapeutic points of view, setting aside certain exceptional cases, sorcerers and the possessed require the same treatment. Chapter 5, some modern ideas on demonopathic possession. Whether we like it or not, the introduction of Freudian psychoanalysis into contemporary thought has spread in the last few decades to all sectors in which the mind is especially concerned. And if one can no longer imagine any literary or artistic criticism, biography, or hagiography without references to the doctrine of the Sage of Vienna, one need not be surprised to learn that not even the devil has escaped the clutches of the psychoanalyst. The capture, we must say, was very easy and therefore very tempting. We know that for believers in the Freudian doctrine, it is necessary to carry out investigations in depth into the earliest steps of the psychological life of the child if we are to begin to grasp the development and birth of the psychopathic disturbances of the adult. Accordingly, since the first psychological analysis began, many philosophers have insisted that the human soul is not simple, and that while it contains noble or sublime tendencies, it is not without instinctive urges, the repression of which demands more suppleness and penetration than many parents and teachers possess. Our personality, our total self, is then composed of an equilibrium of opposing forces, those of the instincts and those which form what the analysts call the superego. What is this? At bottom, but the collection of moral rules imposed by society and religion. It is obvious that this superego must be opposed to the urges of instinct, which desires only pleasure and has no concern for social restrictions or the laws promulgated by morality. So this superego, which can only repeat, you must or you must not, appears as a troubler, a persecutor of the person, thus divided against itself. Video meliora provoke, deteriora secor, Ovid confessed, and Racine says, Mandio quel quer cruel, jacens do homines demor. Thus, man becomes the scene of the duel between God and the devil, the debate between what ought to be and what is. From this conflict springs an anguish, exhausting and insatiable, impelling the subject to eject this superego, which opposes his libidinal aspirations, and leading him to give it the form of the devil. The sentiment of guilt, the weight of a conscience judging itself guilty, that according to the psychoanalyst is the source of the demoniacal illusion. We may go further. Rosette Duval recalls the judgment of Freud. The devil is nothing but the incarnation of the repressed anal impulses. We refrain from exploring Freud's teachings on this point and only note that from the psychoanalytic point of view, to repel or repress the instinctive desires, which are part of the forces of our ego, is useless, for the demon is within us and its repression often only succeeds in reinforcing its power. If we are to believe Duval, it seems that hysteria and schizophrenia correspond most closely to the physical disorders entailed by the struggle of the self against the superego, which overpowers and enslaves it. The conflict induced by schizophrenia appears to be rather of the criminal than the sexual order. The double has not the face of Eros, but of the diabolical superego. The ego can therefore only strive to cast it into outer darkness. We can clearly see that in all its stages, in the very structure of its doctrine, psychoanalysis leads us into the path of animism. The greatest power ever given to men is to give a soul to things which have none. Napoleon. But really, if we jettison all the frail imaginative construction it contains, the doctrine of psychoanalysis strikes an already familiar note. The great Christian mystics, beginning with Saint Teresa of Jesus and Saint John of the Cross, had perfectly divined the psychological mechanism of those deviations of the mind, that imagined duplication of the personality, which is mere illusion. Saint John of the Cross writes, I am appalled at what happens in these days, namely, when a soul with the very smallest experience of meditation, if it be conscious of certain locutions of this kind in some state of recollection, at once christens them all as coming from God, and assumes that this is the case, saying, God said to me, God answered me, whereas it is not so at all, but as we have said, it is for the most part they who are saying it to themselves. The superego, which is made out to be some kind of entity, really corresponds only to a function, which cannot be materialized in such an oversimplified form. To say with Rosette Duval that we project the superego externally under the form of the double, and that this doubling is what we find in all cases of possession and hallucination, is a picturesque metaphor, but no more. If the psychological mechanism invoked by the psychoanalytic school were real source of pseudo-diabolic possession, one would wonder why this deviation of the mind is not more common, and why this singular disturbance only affects a certain category of individuals. In short, psychoanalysis dresses up what we already knew with picturesque and easily grasped images, but we shall be deceived if we look for the secret of demonopathy in the concepts of psychoanalysis. Psychological possession. We cannot be surprised to learn or confirm that many minds which have received an advanced scientific education refuse to believe in the possibility of demoniacal possession, such as was observed in the Middle Ages. I would go further. Many believers seem very annoyed when they are questioned on the validity of the medieval conception of diabolical possession. It is no doubt some such reason which has led a man like Marcel de la Vigne de Villeneuve to imagine a dialogue like those of the encyclopedists, in which two speakers take part, apparently but not really opposed, and both evidently believers. Somewhat disappointed by the incompleteness of the Satan published by Etudes Carmelitaines, and desiring to clarify his faith in the reality of the devil by a thorough knowledge of genuine demoniacal possession, this author imagines himself consulting an expert theologian, Abbe Multy. Does not our conception of the evil one, he adds, give a handle to many critics? Can they not reproach us with giving life to pure abstractions, with actualizing hypostasis in order to make our discourses comprehensible? Is it not the plain truth that Lucifer and all the millions of devils over which he reigns are quite simply the personification of our evil tendencies and our vices? Your critics, declares Abbe Multy, are either ignorant or imbecile. Now we know what our theologian would have us think of the psychoanalyst of the devil. Continuing his demonstration, the Abbe professed that the state of true possession testifies to an intense psychomotor disturbance and reveals the complete dissociation of the personality in which a hostile external control is substituted for the normal individual control of ideas and actions. The devil can, no doubt, take the human form, but it is by no means impossible for him to clothe himself in material or immaterial objects. Thus, the prince of darkness disguises himself willingly, or even preferably, under the appearance of corporate personalities or institutions. The idea of a general obsession, occult and invisible, or of a collective, political and social possession, does in fact help us to explain more easily the rarity of individual diabolic possessions in contemporary society. The violent physical inhabitation of the demon is less and less useful to the enemy of the human race. In place of a spectacular occupation, always liable to provoke vehement reactions, he can advantageously substitute the simple occupation of minds and souls, calmer and more insinuating, but no less sure, fitted for a more rapid contagion and the widest possible diffusion. While rejecting the opinion of Simon Will that the social is irreducibly the domain of the devil, and also that the devil is the father of all kinds of prestige and prestige is social, the learned theologian avows himself convinced that the social milieu is eminently fitted for demoniacal infestation. It is evident that our doctor has been trained in the modern psychological discipline, according to which, and nothing seems better verified, there are no strictly individual facts, whether one accepts it willingly or unwillingly. The doctrines, theories, actions, and tendencies of an epoch are constituted and modeled under the forces of social pressure. In the world of life, as well as in the physical field, there is no completely isolated event. Satan no longer appears as a personage, an isolated figure, but rather as an essence insinuating itself craftily into the hearts of certain states in order to corrupt them by the sin of pride, for pride is always seen to be the essential base of the diabolic. It follows, therefore, that we may hold that Hitlerite Germany, which contained good, useful, and even excellent elements, found itself terribly dominated by the influence of the devil. We may remark that this interpretation is only, in brief, the development of the theory expounded by Dom Alois Major in some brilliant pages in the Satan of the Etudes Carmelitaine. If the Christian is convinced that evil consists essentially in the lust of the flesh, that is, of the senses, in the lust of knowledge and the lust of domination, the pride of life, he must agree that the Nazi society was especially fitted for the growth and hypertrophy of these three modes of concupiscence. Dom Major, who lived in this vitiated atmosphere, therefore considered Hitler to be the medium of Satan. No one who is not deluded could see in Hitler a great personality, either from the point of view of character or of morality. General Jodl said of him at the Nuremberg trial, "He was a great man, but an infernal great man. Given over to lying, he pretends to develop and cultivate relations with the Holy See, but to his initiate, to his intimates, he speaks thus about the Christians. I know how to treat these people in order to reduce them. They will either bend or be broken, and since they are not animals, they will bend. To fight the church, one must beware of making martyrs. It must be withered up. With Hitler, we may compare Aleister Crowley. the most unclean and perverted man in Britain. In Mr. Justice's words, when questioned on his identity, Crowley replied, "Before Hitler was, I am." The ritual of black magic was practiced at his grave. His followers chanted diabolic incantations, the hymn to Pan by Crowley, the hymn to Satan by Carducci. Finally, I recall that the British press referred in 1948 to a report produced by Harry Price, a celebrated demonologist under the aegis of London University, which reveals that in all districts of London, there are hundreds of men and women of excellent education and intellect and high social position who worship the devil and offer him a regular cultus. Black magic, witchcraft, invocation of the devil, these three forms of medieval superstition are practiced today in London on a scale and with a freedom unknown in the Middle Ages. The scale of this work does not permit of further investigation. The literature of the 19th and 20th centuries affords us numerous examples testifying to the importance ascribed to the devil's influence on the body social by novelists, poets, and writers in general. And it is worth noting that on this subject, the preeminence belongs without question to French authors and to the Russian novelists, the greatest of whom is Dostoevsky. But if we grant that the universal influence and penetration of the devil among the collective bodies is probable and predominant, must we therefore deny that the devil can disguise himself very cleverly in the most cunning manner in some master of thought? This is the problem which M. Pierre Bontemps sets himself to solve. There are people who believe that Jean-Paul Sartre is the devil in person, writes this author in the first lines of his book. No, he is not. And to put a stop to any wrong interpretation, I shall say that Jean-Paul Sartre is not the final form of the devil, a reputation which might displease both. I shall try to prove that he is nothing of the sort, but that there is still a relationship between the two, that of possession. Briefly, it is not Sartre who possesses the devil, but the demon which is in him. What reasons move Bontemps to accept the idea, too obvious to simple minds, that Jean-Paul Sartre is a genuine case of demoniacal possession? First, that while Sartre well describes the abandonment, the dereliction of man on the earth, and the anguish that grips him, his thought has no surrounding fringe of affectivity. In contrast with Jaspers, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger, the author of Being and Non-Being, seems to have no conception that things can be comprehended not only with one's reason, but with one's heart. The heart has its reasons, too, which Sartre knows not. Atheist existentialism, by repudiating all lyricism, reduces the human condition to nothing but a little true fact. Man, dispossessed of God, now knows that he can count only on himself. In the vacuum left by the divine dispossession, may there not be established a real possession which gives the explanation of his whole work? To the problem of the existence of God, Sartre replies, no question exists. It is just so. It is quite simple. Even if God existed, it would make no difference. The dereliction would still be there and as full of anguish. In Bontemps' view, what separates the sinner from the possessed lies chiefly in this proposition. The sinner finds himself confronted with the fact of his sin. He glides along with it, being connected with it. In the possessed man, on the contrary, evil is substituted for his personality, and all transcendence establishing the relation of a real subject to the fact of the sin. Keeping them face to face is abolished. The subject has disappeared. There is nothing left but the evil, which is its guest. I have only mentioned this theory of Pierre Bontain's about a writer whose intelligence and critical spirit, no less than the depth and extent of his knowledge, are beyond question, in order to show how far astray a man can be led, lacking a clear and distinct notion of possession. The possessed person, whether genuine or not, can retain a perfectly clear notion of his guilt, his sins. He is not in the least a mere envelope of evil. His conduct is far from automatic, although he cannot always master it. Finally, he who believes in the devil believes in God. But here we are very far from Jean Paul Sartre and from all the atheist philosophers to whom destiny has refused that indefinable gift, that perfume of the spirit, which is charity. Conclusion. As I have tried to show from the events of history or from my own observation, there can be no doubt that even in the present age, when science has shown that so many facts which seemed to our fathers incomprehensible and beyond nature were natural phenomena, many persons have all the appearance of being possessed by the evil spirit, the demon or Satan. The truth of the matter. Ought we to accept as real the diabolical possession of which the New Testament gives so many examples? And if there can be no doubt of the existence of non-genuine possessions, are we in a position to distinguish them from the genuine? Do we possess criteria which prevent us from going astray? To a great extent, an affirmative answer can be given. When, in actual fact, a delirium of demonopathic possession develops, under our observation, according to the same laws which condition a delirium, similar in all respects except color and content, when the same therapeutic treatment proves capable of reducing both kinds, then we must be convinced that the disorder is one whose cause is to be found not in supernature, but in nature itself, nature spoiled by a morbid process. If, on the contrary, the phenomena of possession appear only in a parasitic capacity or are accompanied by very high qualities of mind and heart, then the doctor must call in the qualified theologian, the exorcist. There should be no need to add that when the subject of the supposed possession belongs to a religious community or order, it is for the religious superiors to carry out the first examination and to decide on the case. One last question for the theorist. When the devil enters into a man's soul and body, can he reveal his presence exclusively by the semblance of a mental or bodily illness? In other words, when the doctor recognizes in a patient all the elements of a definitive disease, has he the right to see in it only the effects of a natural process, even when a scientific treatment is able to cure it? It is not for me to resolve this problem, and on this point, the reader must form his own judgment according to his beliefs.